I think pioneers that are doing something unique and new, people want to listen to. He's proven. He has a pedigree that I think gives him a lot of leeway to do some unique things.
Question 12. The game is nearly perfect. What else do you think you can improve on? What else is there left to do?
Hey everyone, Gran Turismo 7 is finally here. As a racing game enthusiast, Gran Turismo is a franchise that I've been wanting to discuss for some time, as it's basically racing game royalty and the third best-selling racing game franchise of all time. Many people, myself included, have fond memories of playing GT 1 through 4 on the PlayStation 1 and 2, and GT 4 in particular is considered to be the pinnacle of the franchise. Despite this fondness for the franchise, and while GT is still immensely popular, it has seen a bit of decline with the last few entries. Some of this has to do with the timing of the releases, as it's been a long time since we've seen a numbered GT game, the last one being GT6 back in December 2013. Surprisingly, it was released only on the PlayStation 3, even though it came out a month after the PlayStation 4 launched. It wasn't until 2017 that we finally saw a Gran Turismo game on the PlayStation 4, that being the tepidly received GT Sport. While its gameplay seemed to be generally well received, many features were missing and the amount of cars and tracks at launch were bare bones at best. Granted, through updates, eventually many more cars and tracks were added in, but the game never shook off that initial release reaction stigma, although it did end up selling quite well. Given how racing games have exploded in popularity over the past several years, especially sim racing games in particular, I expected Sony to come out swinging with GT7 to crush the competition. Games like Assetto Corsa, the yearly F1 releases, and others provide incredible simulation racing experiences that feel true to life in many ways. Even somewhat arcadey racing games like Forza Horizon 5 have reached very high levels of realism in certain racing mechanics, which has helped the game explode in popularity. With the Gran Turismo series given the Real Driving Simulator nickname, most would assume Kazunori Yamauchi and his team at Polyphony Digital would strive to create the most immersive and realistic simulation driving experience in gaming, second to none. So with all that said, let's take an in-depth look at Gran Turismo 7 and see how it compares to its past entry GT Sport and how well it stacks up against its tough competition in the racing game space. And if you do enjoy the video, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe for more gaming reviews, guides, and discussions. We have a lot to go over today, so let's get into it. Gran Turismo has changed quite a bit over the years, and if you have not played since the PS1 or 2 days, it might take some getting used to. Since it's a simulation racing game, it strives to be as realistic as possible, making it difficult for newcomers. The main difference for how hard the game will be for players will be which assist settings they use. I tried out the game on all settings to see how it will play for both veterans and newcomers alike, so I'll be going over that later on in the review when I go over the racing mechanics and how well they hold up. While I spent the majority of my playtime using a DualSense controller, I did also test out my G29 racing wheel, so I'll be going over my experience with both. Polyphony did state that they want the game to be accessible for all players, so we will have to see if they live up to that claim. Cars can now be upgraded using a variety of parts which will increase the car's performance points, basically their power level. It's nice to see a better upgrade system in place this time around, reminiscent of older games. There's also engine and car maintenance that will have to be kept up with if you keep using the same cars for races. We also now get 3 car dealerships, the Used Car Shop, Brand Central, and Legendary Cars, so it's a huge range of both cheap, classic, and performance cars to choose from. I'll go over all of these gameplay mechanics in greater detail, but first I do want to go into something that was missing from GT Sport, an actual single-player campaign. But before we go over that, I do want to mention that GT7 is a live service game. This means the game will see updates over time that will change and hopefully improve things and add in more content. This review is a reflection of what Sony felt comfortable releasing as a finished product at launch while increasing the price to $70 alongside adding in free-to-play mobile game-style microtransactions. When you first go into GT7's main menu, you'll immediately notice a lot has changed, or at least in the presentation. It's pretty clear they wanted to bring back various features and visually give the game some touching up on a surface level. In Sport, you basically just had drop-down menus that you navigated through with a mouse pointer. Now in GT7, we get greeted by a town filled with various shops and places that represent everything the game has to offer, even if they do basically function in the same way as they did in GT Sport. However, before you can jump into everything, there is a single-player story mode, well, kind of one, that unlocks all the features as you go through it. This is the new Gran Turismo Cafe, one of the most promoted new features of the game that was seen in the pre-release marketing materials. This cafe is where you will spend a lot of time in between races in your first 10 to 20 hours or so of gameplay, The time spent in the cafe missions will vary from person to person depending on how many times you have to repeat them. It will give you missions that will reward new cars, roulette tickets, and unlock new tracks and gameplay areas. And while it is a bit lacking, it is nice to have at least some sort of structure compared to GT Sport, and there are some decent rewards awarded along the way as well. Most missions are to collect 3 cars belonging to a set, generally 3 cars of the same brand or something like 3 hot hatch cars or things of that nature. It will have you race on various tracks, and placing at the required position, generally 3rd or higher, will award you one of the cars that you need to collect. Other missions are typically to visit and try out each location in the GT Village, places like the used car dealership, the Scapes editor, and more. And once you've gone through the racetracks of a certain area, there will be a championship consisting of several races that you will have to beat to progress. Each race in the championship will award points, and again, typically you'll need to be in the top 3 or so to beat the mission. After completing the collection missions, you will get info on the types of cars you had to collect, something car enthusiasts should enjoy, as some of the information was pretty interesting. Although, on the other end, if you're not an enthusiast, you'll probably just be mashing the X button to get through these sections. I do wish there had been some voice acting for these settings, as the huge silent text dumps felt a bit on the lazy side of things. Again, I'm glad they at least put some kind of single-player campaign into the game, which did help my enjoyment level when compared to going through GT Sports races. However, it felt very bare bones and is more of an extended tutorial than anything. And it ends very abruptly at GT4 classes of cars, and my best guess is that this was intentional, as they did not want to award any expensive cars due to the microtransactions, something I will absolutely be talking about more later in the review. But that said, the GT Cafe is not the only single-player experience in GT7, as licensed tests and missions also make a return. If you thought the driving tests were too easy in Sport, good news. There are now several tests that will make you want to break your controller in half in frustration. Or at least if you want to get a gold trophy anyways. However, getting bronze isn't too bad, and you will have to get several licenses to progress through the cafe quests, as certain ones are required to enter into the championship missions. While I did finish all the license tests in the game, I did only go for gold in the first 2 license categories. Much like in Sport, you will be rewarded with a free car for completing all tests in a licensed category with at least bronze trophy, and then again when you get a gold trophy in all tests. I really can't stress how utterly obnoxious some tests are, and unless you're the Lewis Hamilton of video game racing, you're probably going to be doing those certain tests over and over, shaving off 1,000th of a second at a time. I wish I was being hyperbolic here, but I am not the only one having this issue. I am now going for gold in all the tests as is required for the Platinum Trophy, but if I wasn't going for that Platinum Trophy, I don't think it would be worth it. The payout for the tests relative to the difficulty for completing them is almost insulting, and you'd probably get the cars it awards much faster by grinding the money through other means. But if you do enjoy that style of challenge, GT7 will absolutely provide it for you. Missions are basically in the same boat. They are more varied than in GT Sport, although getting gold on certain ones is going to be a nightmare. You'll get to do everything from drift trials to missions where you have to hit every traffic cone you see in a set amount of time. There's a pretty steep difficulty curve as well with certain ones, and it can vary greatly even through each set of missions, of which each set has its own difficulty rating. For example, the drag racing ones, while very fun, were extremely easy to get gold on. Only in the final drag racing race did I have to slightly tune my Lamborghini Aventador alongside adding in a nitro to win. Others, I only got a bronze trophy in by the skin of my teeth, although granted I was rushing through all of them for the review and not trying to get better scores after I finished each one. The one-lap magic missions in particular were insane. Basically, you start with a very fast car but have to wait a set amount of time while all the other cars get a huge head start on you. But between the license tests and missions, it's going to be extremely hit or miss if someone enjoys them, as they can get very frustrating at times. And this is probably where it's going to differ for huge GT enthusiasts and people who only casually play the game. But when it comes to getting gold on all the missions, it's going to heavily depend if you really want that car that is awarded for it. And some of the missions can be really time-consuming, some of which being 24 minutes and 30 minutes long, which if you lose can be really devastating. Outside of the missions, license test, and GT Cafe, we also have all the normal single-player activities returning to the game. There's a far better track variety throughout the single-player mode as well when compared to GT Sport when it launched. There's 63 tracks across 34 locations. It's a pretty decent amount to start off with, and more will be added in future updates. While that is technically less than Sport has now at 82, Sport launched with an insanely low 29, so it's doing much better on that front. It's better with car variety too, with 420 at launch compared to just 168 at sports launch, although it's now over 330 after updates. That being said, I'm fairly certain they are using the same game engine for GT7 and Sport, which means they probably just reused the cars from Sport and updated them for 7, along with adding in some new ones. The same is more than likely true for the tracks, although it really does seem like a bit more work went into touching up existing ones. We also get the return of several series mainstay tracks like Trial Mountain that were missing in Sport. The biggest change seems to be added in extra visual effects for the PlayStation 5 version, and it does seem like some work went into greater defining height changes throughout each course. When it comes to the physical tracks themselves, it's some of the most detailed work I've seen in a racing game. The same can't be said about the stadiums and everything outside the actual track itself, as environments do seem to be a bit lacking. Even with PlayStation 5 enhancements, they only very marginally look better than they did in Sport. Honestly, this doesn't make much difference to me as long as the game plays well. While the environments may look a little dated, the cars do not. They look absolutely fantastic. I'm not sure if they look quite as good as in Forza Horizon 5, but it's so close, I don't think it really matters. Again, this is an area I'm not too picky on, but if you're looking to take some insane photos of cars, then yes, they look incredible enough to do so. There's dynamic weather, which does look nice, and puddles on the ground are very well represented. Clouds look great, although I did have issues actually seeing the rain falling even when it was very heavy. I generally knew it was raining because I could hear it raining instead of actually being able to see it. This was an issue with and without HDR on, and even when I tried the game out on my gaming monitor, it still was not well represented. It must have just been my TVs, as other people expressed that it looks great. It could have been an issue with the exposure slider, as I did see that listed in the game's patch notes that it was glitched. They said they have fixed it, but I still haven't found the right setting for it to make the game look its best. Outside the rain audio, which does sound good, in general the sound design feels very dated. It's seen very little improvements over GT Sport, and games like Forza Horizon 5 and F1 2021 are significantly better in the audio department. Although one nice thing is that you do get quite a few options in the audio settings to change each individual sound's level. When it comes to car selection, like I said, we get a lot more than GT Sport had, although it's still over 100 less than Forza Horizon 5 had at launch, not to mention tons of cars that have been added in since. GT7 will be adding in more cars though, so only time will tell how many more we get. Sport saw over 200 ones added in after launch, so we could get quite a few more. Not to say that over 400 isn't enough. Chances are the vast majority of people will never drive more than a few cars that they like anyways. But some people, like myself, do enjoy the car collecting aspect of the game, so it is an important gameplay aspect for people like me. But when I compare the list between GT7 and Sport, they are strikingly similar. So how is the selection then? Basically all the major car brands are represented here with a decent variety. That said, it's mostly cars from a few years ago and older, as cars made 3 years or less ago are mostly absent outside of a few 19 and 20 models. There's a selection of both low and high-end cars, although it does seem like the mid to high-range cars do see the most representation. I really would have liked to have seen more newer models though. For instance, I really like the new Aston Martin Vulcans. We again, like in Sport, only get the 2016 model, which is nice, don't get me wrong, I'm happy it's in the game, but why can't we get the 2022 model also? Although we do get some nice new additions like the 2014 Ferrari FXXK added in, which is really great to see in the series. It does seem like we will need some updates to really fill up the car list in some areas, but with how grindy the game is, don't plan on getting them all without grinding excessively. Or better yet for Sony, open up your wallet and pay for the horrendously overpriced microtransactions so you can get the car you want in a game that costs $70. But before I get into that, and believe me, we will get into that, let's finish up what else you can expect from the single player side of things. More specialty races will unlock as you progress through the cafe missions. For instance, you might unlock a 10-lap touring car race on a certain track where you have to manage your fuel and tires, or another race that limits each car's performance points to a 600 cap. They will reward varying amounts of money, and unfortunately the monetary rewards have little rhyme or reason, as only a small amount of select races reward anything worthwhile. This means if you want to afford one of the higher end cars, there are very, very few viable options for levels to grind money on, which is disappointing because there's certain tracks that I really enjoy more than others. And for instance, I love Monza. I would love to be able to grind for money on Monza, but that race rewards like next to nothing. Other than that, we get time trials, arcade races, custom races, and track experience. There are things to like about the custom races. You get to customize basically anything you can think of except for snow, which is for some reason absent. This is where you'll get to really improve your skills and get in good practice for the online matches, as you can set things like lap time violations, realistic car damage, fuel consumption, nitrous boost, and more. You can even set the weather pattern, which will dynamically change throughout the race, making you have to strategically choose when to pit and change tires. Honestly, I really do have to praise GT7 here. For a console sim racing game, it's a fantastic custom race mode, and it really does give an incredible amount of variety to choose from. Unfortunately, even on the most difficult settings, you will only get an insultingly low amount of money rewarded, but this is still a great way to practice once you've grinded for the car you want. There's also the newly added in Music Rally mode. It's actually separate from the main game, and currently there are 6 musical tracks that you can race to, with more being added in future updates. You race along a track to the beats in the song, and depending on how far you go, you'll be awarded a bronze, silver, or gold trophy. It's actually a pretty fun mode, but it feels very disconnected from the main game, and with only 6 tracks in the game of time riding, it can be finished in a very little amount of time. So what about the racing mechanics? Well, that's a pretty complicated subject. How well they are implemented varies wildly from car to car, and your experience will heavily depend on if you use a controller or wheel, which assists you turn off and on, and then your general racing game experience. If you have not played a racing game in a long time, maybe since GT3 or 4, or none at all, then I think there will be a substantial learning curve and the game will be extremely difficult for some time. I'd strongly recommend for newcomers to turn on all assist outside of auto steering and maybe auto braking, as learning how to corner properly and brake in GT7 will be a huge challenge. Even with all assist on certain cars, especially on the low end, they can be extremely difficult to control and will spin out or slide off the track seemingly almost at random, especially when using soft tires. I think they undertuned the assist a bit too much, and it may require several patches before they work out a better experience for brand new players. If you stick with it and slowly take off the assist, then it's a playable game, but I just want people to be aware of what they will be getting into. It will be at times a very frustrating learning experience and will take a lot of practice. The license test should be there to teach new players how to play the game, but they seem like they're there more to challenge GT veterans than anything else. That said, you will learn basic racing mechanics by doing the license test, so doing them can be helpful, but seriously do not worry about getting gold on every test, as it might drive you insane. Another issue is that there seems to be a huge focus on tuning a car's setting to get it to handle and brake just right, which is going to be a big positive for people who enjoy doing that. I'm one of them. But it will be extremely overwhelming for a new player, and unlike in Forza Horizon, you cannot share your tuning settings, so people will have to go to YouTube or websites to find the best tunings for each car if you want to get the best times possible in each track, or in some cases, even just make the car drivable. When it comes to the experience for racing game veterans who play with all assists off, I felt a bit underwhelmed by the racing experience in general when using a controller. It's clear they took GT Sport's driving mechanics and just tweaked around some settings, and I think it could have used some more work, as in some areas it's rather lacking. The best way I can describe it is if a car drives well in GT7, which doesn't actually represent if it drives well in real life or not, then it will drive well with or without assists. If a car drives poorly in GT7 and that car may drive very well in real life, then it will drive poorly with or without assists on. I think they undertuned the low performance cars to work a lot worse than they really should in order to prop up the better cars. I had the same issue with GT Sport as well. It just doesn't seem like they put any effort into the low end cars to really make them accurately represent how they drive in real life, like the game is kind of, marketed to do so. And I know a lot of people who enjoy Gran Turismo because they get not only to drive supercars, but also drive the cars they own in real life and be able to have fun with both of them. The problem is exacerbated by the tuning shop. I think they made the base level performance of most cars worse than it actually should be in order to make room for the upgrades, instead of the base level performance being realistic, then improved with upgrades. Or at least with the low-end cars, certain cars like GT3 and GT4 cars cannot be upgraded, so all you can do is fine-tune their settings, and honestly, they felt so much better to drive than anything else because the performance felt like it actually should out of the box. It's a bit hard to critique the gameplay here because it varies so wildly from car to car, and obviously, I didn't have the time to grind for all 430 cars. It would have taken hundreds of hours to do so. But when I did get a car that felt like it worked like it should, it was a fun game to play, but when it didn't, the cars felt almost undrivable without the assist on. With the assist on, it's obviously a different experience. The biggest offenders here are the counter steering assistance and traction control. It's clear the team knew counter steering was an issue, as even when you select the expert settings preset, it still has this set to strong. I'd recommend at the very least leaving it on weak for the first half of the cafe missions, as without it on, the cheap cars are very difficult to control. They definitely changed some aspect of the counter steering, as I never turned it on in Sport, but without it on in GT7, some cars felt miserable to drive when using a controller. Traction control does feel like it's more important this time around due to the greater focus and height changes on the tracks. Tire spin, especially on cars with high acceleration, can be a real problem, and it actually was a pretty decent implementation, although it will need some tweaks before it feels just right when using a controller. And on tracks that have a lot of height changes, especially upward inclines, it makes it a real challenge with traction control off, and I did see a noticeable difference when changing the settings between 5 and 0. The braking indicator I'd rate almost broken, as if it's flashing it means you should have braked several seconds ago, so it will not be very useful for new players learning how to corner, which was not the case in GT Sport, as it felt like it worked far better there. The braking area assist works a bit better, especially for lower end cars, although I found it to be off quite often with higher performance cars, often telling you to hit the brakes harder than needed, although it's not so bad as to not be helpful, and it will help at least brand new players learn the basics of where to brake around tricky corners. I fairly consistently found brakes in general to perform worse than they should, even when fully upgraded. I didn't have time to tune the brakes for every car I tested, but out of the box, they do not work as well as they should. Basically, plan on braking early when using a controller, especially if you turn the ABS off. Brakes have 3 modes for ABS: off, weak, and default. I generally turn ABS off, but I think I'll be leaving it on in GT7. Even on default or weak, brakes will still lock up very easily with certain cars, and with ABS off, they lock up constantly, more often than I've seen in any other game. I think they are made to lock up easier on purpose to highlight the haptic feedback, which I had to turn off because it can be painful to use for too long. So I do think my experience might have been made a little bit worse because I turned it off, and if you do leave it on, your experience might be better, but it's still not everyone wants to leave the haptic feedback on. But otherwise, shifting feels pretty good. There's a bit of delay with older cars, which I did think was a nice touch, and it's noticeable through the DualSense for added immersion. Some cars will get stuck on certain gears with automatic transmission, so unless you individually tune the gears yourself, manually shifting should have the edge in most cases. The problem with slowing down is made worse by the game having a horrible representation of speed, as going 20 miles per hour or 100 is almost indistinguishable. And I'll admit, this issue could be what's throwing me off in regards to the brakes, although I did find the brakes to work differently when using different input methods, so I'm not sure if that is the case. This was a problem in Sport as well, and it looks like the issue saw no updates. When compared to any other racing game I've played recently like Need for Speed Heat, Forza Horizon 5, F1 2021, and Assetto Corsa, GT7 just does not do a very good job at all of representing how fast a car is moving, which caused me some serious issues at first, although I am starting to get used to it. There's also auto steer and auto drive, which is great for younger players, and for accessibility, which can be paired with a gyro steering. I was pretty surprised to see the gyro added in, and I'm so glad they did it. Some people might actually end up preferring this to the thumbsticks, as it does seem to work pretty well. That said, it was awkward to get used to, and I drove horribly when using it, but if someone practices with it, I can see it potentially being just as good, if not better, than using the sticks. Overall, I do think there's a lot of work the team needs to do to improve the driving mechanics through updates, but, it is fixable. They are by no means bad, and I think my issues are more that other racing sims are much more accurate now when compared to how GT Sport was, and with them updating the racing mechanics only very marginally in GT7, it feels a lot worse than it actually is. But when you call yourself the real driving simulator, you really should be ready to compete with the best, and in that regard, GT7 does not hit the mark. When it comes to the DualSense features, I have to praise GT7 here for the haptic feedback with the triggers. This is one of the best implementations I've seen in a racing game, and you can even change the intensity of the brakes and accelerator separately, something I would really like to see in more racing games. It will help with tire spin if you have the traction control off, and the resistance of the brakes does help immersion. Although in both cases, I do think they overtuned the tire spin and brakes locking up, because I noticed that being an issue more often when turning off the haptic feedback. When it comes to the vibration features, it's a real mixed bag, as in some regards, it's the best implementation I've seen, and on the other end, it leaves a lot to be desired. So when it comes to simulating sensations like driving through a puddle, over a curb, or even when you get your car washed, it's insane how realistic and spot on the vibration is. I don't think there's a better implementation I've seen since Spider-Man Miles Morales, and it might even be better here. It also does a great job for height changes, which will be important when not using traction control. They even made it so you can really feel a car shifting gears when in manual mode, especially in older cars with a stick shift. The huge problem is that, while these sensations are great for increasing immersion, they almost completely forgot the most important thing about force feedback in a racing game, assisting the racing game mechanics. There's really no resistance when turning outside of some very minor tire squeal, so basically the force feedback does little to inform you if you're going too fast around a corner. And that could have been very helpful, as some cars are very difficult to drive with the assists off. When it comes to driving on dirt, it feels very lackluster, especially when compared to the incredible implementation we saw in Forza Horizon 5. So when it comes to the DualSense, it's a mixed bag, and while it's nice to have, do not feel like you're missing out on too much, or really at all if you're still on PlayStation 5. I personally turned it off once I was done testing, as it can hurt to use the haptic feedback in longer play sessions, but that will vary person to person. And like I said, they do need to still retune and tweak some of the settings when you're not using that haptic feedback. Now that is my feelings when using a controller. When using a wheel, it's almost like playing a different game. And again, I use a Logitech G29 wheel, and given how varied wheels can be, I know the experience might differ from wheel to wheel, but this should give you at least a general idea of what to expect. I get that a wheel will almost always be a better experience, but this is a console exclusive release. They really should have focused more on the experience with a controller. Seriously, once I used my wheel, I really didn't want to go back. Brakes felt far more realistic and more responsive, conversely making corner feel much more realistic and resolved my issue with downshifting. The force feedback out of the box for me felt great, although again this will vary depending on your setup. There's still the issue of speed not being properly represented, but just having the brakes and handling work better, I ended up having so much more fun. It's funny too because I tried out a Pagani with fully upgraded brakes. When using a controller, I had to slam on the brakes far earlier and for far longer than realistically it should have been needed. But once I switched to the wheel, the brakes worked perfectly and ended up being one of the best handling cars I drove in GT7, and it was that much more fun because of that. So it does seem like the experience can vary in the same car between which input method you use. But in general, I had so much more fun when using the wheel when compared to the controller. And for reference, I am someone who typically uses a controller in simulation racing games. I've held out on going over how performance points work for cars, the tuning shop and car dealerships, as they all represent different sides of the same issue. The game is built from the ground up to be extremely grindy in order to annoy you into buying microtransactions. Now I had a full video going over this issue in length, but it's actually even worse than when I originally thought after playing through the game more. So firstly, performance points. Like I said earlier, it's basically the power level of your car. Certain events will have caps on how high it can go to enter, which means you have to strategically tune your car and choose the parts that will best benefit you in a race. Now that's good game design, and on that end, I do like that we have this option now to greater customize our cars compared to GT Sport. It was really fun to take my Camaro, which was a car I used the most through the campaign, and upgrade it through the missions and see it get faster and handle better. There's plenty of options, as you will get to choose different types of turbochargers, brakes, various engine tune-ups, tires, and even add nitrous. Tires can greatly affect your car's power level, so when you're trying to hit a certain performance level, you can choose to have better tires but worse engine parts, thus having less horsepower, or vice versa. Problems start to crop up in the tuning shop, however, as firstly, each car only starts with one type of tires. This means you'll have to spend well over 100,000 credits to get a full set of tires. Also, some engine upgrades are final, meaning you have to buy an expensive new engine if you want to change things around. That's not including the fact that you can't even tune your car's settings without first getting specific upgrades that will allow you to do so. For instance, you can't tune a car's weight or suspension without getting upgrades for it first. Some cars, like I mentioned earlier, like GT3 and 4 cars, will come with some of those upgrades, but generally not all of them, and you cannot change out engine parts typically for those cars, only tune the settings. Once you do unlock all the tuning settings, then there is a considerable amount to change, so enthusiasts will have plenty to tinker with. And specifically in that regard, GT7 does do a very good job. You really can change around basically anything you can think of. Then there's the customization building in the GT Village. This allows you to completely customize your car's look, get an oil change, car wash, and service the engine. The car's look actually does come into effect with the gameplay too, as adding a high rear wing can seriously help certain cars' stability and make them more drivable. Unfortunately, while in theory I like all of these additions, they are again all built to cost a ton of credits, making it so you'll have to grind for everything. And it's not so much a problem that they cost in-game credits, that's fine. It's the fact that everything in the game is set to suck your game wallet dry, and every time you are awarded credits in the game, it reminds you that you can top off your credits by paying real-world money. You get no paint colors, there's thousands to choose from, but you'll have to buy each and every one that you want to apply to your car. Any changes like adding a skirt to the car or a wing will also cost money. Oil changes, car wash, and servicing the engine will also cost you, and as you drive your car more, each one will be required. But that's not too much of a problem, right? How much can they cost? Oil changes 30 credits, that's not too bad. Car wash is 400, better be one f***ing amazing car wash, but manageable. And servicing the engine costs 100,000 credits.
What? What?
In some cases, it'll actually be cheaper to rebuy the car and its upgrades than service the engine. Also, a car's rigidity needs to be touched up over time, costing 30,000 credits. It's clear that they wanted to always have a way to drain your credits even if you somehow bought every car and all of their upgrades. Even if you did that and wanted to save your money for when they added in new cars, there's a hard cap of 20 million credits, so you will not be able to save up huge amounts. You are also unable to sell cars as well, which is, as far as I know, has been a mainstay of the series. I know in Sport you could not sell gift cars, but you could at least sell the cars you bought yourself. Also, you cannot test out cars before driving them, and with some cars handling feeling very off, it's a huge gamble whenever you purchase a new expensive car. Now the car dealerships, it's just buying cars. I mean, how could they possibly mess that up? It's a game where a huge part of it is collecting cars. Surely they want to allow players to have as much fun as possible, and when they save up the credits to buy a car, it will be easy for them to just buy it, right? Yeah, so there's 3 different dealerships. They use Car Shop, Brand Dealership, and Legendary Car Shop. The Brand Dealership is pretty straightforward and literally, and I mean literally identical to how it was in GT Sport. Here you can buy cars made after 2001, and for historic car brands you can visit the museum to get to find out about that car's history. The museum again is the same as in GT Sport, but it's a nice feature for people who are really into cars and actually did enjoy browsing through it. The Brand Dealership isn't the issue though, it's the Used Car Shop and Legendary Car Shop. They are both on a daily rotational timer, meaning if you don't buy a car that you want, it might be gone the next day. It's almost like they're pressuring people into buying a car they really want because they will fear on losing out on getting it if they do not. If only there was some catchy phrase to describe this aggressive behavior, but alas, since I know of none of them, I'll call it what it is. Predatory that doesn't belong in any game, let alone one that costs $70 to buy. The Legendary Car Shop is particularly atrocious as the cars are extremely expensive and generally, well, really nice cars that many people will want. It's just a very transparent attempt to pressure people into buying microtransactions if they can't afford the car because of FOMO. Both used and legendary cars have various amounts of miles on them as well. This means the engine will need to be either serviced immediately or not long after buying it, forcing you to spend even more credits or else the car will lose performance. Oh yeah, and I haven't mentioned how much the microtransactions cost as well. It's literally, and I mean literally, the same as in a free-to-play mobile game. You get 100,000 credits for $2.50, 250,000 credits for $5, 750,000 credits for $10, and 2 million credits for $20. Not only are these prices astronomically high, there's a million credit option clearly missing. Many cars cost exactly 1 million credits to buy in the game, so it's pretty obvious this was done so it would force whales and people who don't have tons of hours to grind the same level over and over for credits to buy the 2 million credit option when they probably would have just wanted to buy a 1 million credit option instead. There's a few cars that cost over 3 million credits, which means you have to spend $80 to buy 2 cars, which is more than the PlayStation 5 version of the game cost. For 2 cars! There's also some legendary cars that can cost 12 million credits or more. And making things even better is that for legendary cars, the prices change in real time. At a time where car price inflation is insanely high for both new and used cars, and especially when classic car prices have skyrocketed. It's just insane that they could even conceive that being a good idea. Again, it's blatantly clear they did this on purpose to make grinding for those cars to take even longer. At least the problem couldn't get worse, right? Yeah, about that. They decided to enable the microtransactions the day after the game went live, meaning that they were not in when review outlets were reviewing the game, meaning that many mainstream reviews do not even mention them at all, meaning people could buy the game without knowing about any of these practices. Also, an aside, knowing how long review outlets actually had to review the game, they did not have enough time to fully review it, as there literally was not enough time to go through everything, but that is a topic for another day. So yes, the microtransactions are disgusting, and it's clear they built the game from the ground up to annoy people into buying them. Which is such a shame because if these gameplay mechanics had been handled better, they could have been fun. Just everything costs way more than it should, and you're really not awarded enough credits in game fast enough. When it comes to the online multiplayer experience, it was one of the worst I've had to date in a racing game. I guess the good news is that your driver rating will be carried over from Sport, although that doesn't help new players or ones like myself who didn't play Sport's online modes. Basically, there's 2 online modes, one that has 2 daily races with specific restrictions that will improve your driver and safety ratings depending on your performance, and then basically a free play mode where people can completely customize a race to their specifications and have up to 16 people join. The daily races offer an insultingly low amount of credits, so even if you just want to play the online mode, you will be forced to grind in single player regardless. Not to mention you do have to progress through the cafe missions a bit just to unlock the multiplayer. It has a 15-minute registration period where you're allowed to do qualifying laps, and the better time you get in the qualifying mode, the better your starting position will be on the grid. Qualifying is extremely important, as in this mode I had people constantly smash into me to the point where the game was unplayable. This is a problem in most racing games online, but this was by far the worst experience I've had. Not to mention, the slightest tap can cause you to spin out wildly, so here it's all the more painful when people smash into you. I even got flagged when people hit me sometimes, which is utterly baffling. From what I've seen on Reddit, this is a pretty common experience. When it comes to the free play mode, I actually did have more fun here, but I ran into some pretty severe lag. People would teleport around me, making it almost impossible to drive properly at times, as I would never know where they would appear as they smash into every wall. But these are lobby-based, so if you have friends, this is where you can play with them and customize your experience to however you want. There is also a split-screen mode as well, although I was unable to test that out. So with all that out of the way, let's go over the last few things and my final thoughts. Well, the presentation of the main menu has changes via the GT Village. Outside of that, the UI and some other areas are virtually identical to GT Sport, which didn't have the best UI to begin with, and it feels very lazy that no improvements were made, or even some changes just to make GT7 feel like a fresh experience compared to GT Sport. When it comes to the AI, it's improved over GT Sport only by a hair. The only real difference I noticed is that sometimes one AI will try and overtake another, although this will cause them to clump up together at times, completely blocking a track. Otherwise, the AI behaves identically to Sport. They will still smash into you, causing nothing to happen to them, but making your car spin out of control, throwing you off the track. This made me lose a few races because they would slam into my backside, and due to rubber banding, it was virtually impossible to catch back up. It has the common issue where the front AI will skyrocket in front of the others, and catching up can be a challenge, even on easy if there's only 2 or 3 laps, but it really depends on how long a track is. And the reason for this is because you do not start on a grid, but instead the missions have you do a rolling start at the end of the line. And on some tracks, the front AI can start more than half a lap ahead of you. This again was only a problem on large tracks with a low amount of laps, as I would generally eventually catch up, but sometimes that was quite difficult. And honestly, because of the rubber banding, I had real trouble distinguishing easy, medium, and hard difficulty, so I'm not sure if the AI is actually bugged or not. Difficulty or any setting change will not affect your credit payout like it does in Forza Horizon 5, and it's pretty clear that was done to make it harder to grind for credits. Dirt racing felt like GT Sport's weakest aspect, and it's unchanged in GT7. I did get better after practicing it, but it's nowhere near as good as it is in the Dirt series or even in Forza Horizon. It just feels like your car is on ice skates and the physics are completely broken when it comes to jumps or any bumps in the road. Honestly, in my opinion, it's so bad it's not even a fun gameplay mode in any capacity to me, and I wish they could have put any amount of effort into improving the dirt racing physics. And of course, they had to make a dirt race track the best way to grind money by a considerable margin, so if you do not enjoy the dirt racing, you better start enjoying it, because keep in mind you will be forced to grind on a dirt racing track for dozens of hours to afford the cars you want to buy. And because GT7 is a live service game, an online connection is required to play the game. I've seen some wildly different accounts of what can be done offline. All I can report is what I experienced when playing in offline mode. For me, all that was available was the music rally mode and arcade races where I have a very, very small selection of cars to choose from. All facilities, including the car dealership, the single-player missions, license tests, and everything else is disabled when offline, and if you do not have a stable internet connection, I will say right now this game is not worth buying at any price. There's also an issue when the game has server maintenance, as the game is unplayable at that time outside of what I just mentioned. And in offline mode, you cannot earn money in these arcade races, so again, the game is basically not even worth playing in offline mode. I ran into some severe performance issues on PlayStation 5 as well. It's generally a locked 60 FPS in license test, and if you're racing alone on a track. However, certain areas on certain tracks constantly had huge FPS drops when racing against AI, especially if it was raining. The FPS drops seemed to make the driving physics mess up as well, and I found myself smashing into a wall because of it. This is something that can be fixed in patches, but it is an issue for now. There's a performance and ray tracing mode on PlayStation 5, although it's pretty misleading. Both modes are identical in racing. Even with the ray tracing mode on, you will not get ray tracing while racing. The only real difference is that you will drop down to 30 FPS in replays and videos with ray tracing enabled, which felt incredibly awkward, and I just kept the performance mode on. The thing that frustrates me so much is that while there are absolutely big areas of the gameplay that need some pretty serious work, when things work well, it can be a really fun game to play. But that's rare, and I had to try out a ton of cars and tune them just right to get a good experience. and that good experience falls short when compared to other racing sim games I've played. It's pretty clear this game is going to take several months, if not a year or longer, of updates and patches to fix some of the issues and driving mechanics. And I just do not see them placing the time and effort needed to catch up to where other racing games are today. When it comes to recommending the game or not, it's going to depend like always. In most cases, it's wait for a big sale a year or so from now once the game has seen multiple updates. It's not that it's a bad game necessarily, it's more the fact that there are plenty of other racing games to play that are better. Then we get the microtransaction issue on top of that. I just can't recommend Gran Turismo 7 at full price, especially if you plan on using a controller. If you do have a nice wheel setup, I do think the game is far more enjoyable that way, although again, there's better options when it comes to simulation racing with nice wheel setups. In that case, it might not be a bad buy when it's on sale, assuming you've already played those other games and are looking for something new. It drives me insane, but this is the type of racing game I love the most. One's focused on track and circuit racing with a ton of cars to choose from. Had they spent the time to make a better single-player experience, really put the time and effort into making all cars perform as they should, and completely rebalance the game's economy and remove the microtransactions, I would have really enjoyed this game. I really love collecting cars, but with how insane the game's economy works, it has sucked any fun out of that process to be had. I just don't like grinding on the same level over and over and over again for dozens of hours to get the money needed to collect all of them. They do have the daily workout return where you have to drive for just over 26 miles. It gives you roulette tickets. The tickets have randomized rewards. You are not awarded a car every time. Basically, there's 5 different things you can win. It can be either a car, a part for a random car, one that you may or may not own, a random amount of money, and then a ticket to buy one of the expensive cars. Yes, you need to win a randomized ticket and a randomized roulette thing just to have the privilege to buy an expensive car, and it's on a real-world timer. It is a 1-year timer, so it does seem like you get plenty of time. But if you have someone who picks up the game only here and there, that might be pressured into buying it because they don't know if they're going to win that ticket again once it runs out of the time. And honestly, every single roulette ticket I've gotten has given me the least amount of money, which is either 2,000 or 5,000 credits, depending on the tier of roulette ticket you're randomly awarded. So on that aspect, it's even worse than it was in Sport. I'll certainly keep my eye on this game and see how it improves over time, because it is a live service and we will see continual updates. Like I said earlier, Sport didn't start off in the best state, but through updates it has become a much better game, not only adding new tracks and tons of cars, but also improving the game's physics and driving mechanics as well. Hopefully they can do the same in GT7, and assuming they do this, it might be a good buy on sale a few years down the road. All that said, nothing excuses the microtransactions. It's a $70 game, and there is no place for a mobile, free-to-play style economy. It's sad that this is where gaming is now, and it's a really bad stain on what has been a really good run by Sony lately. Needless to say, I'm fairly disappointed and really do hope they are able to fix the game over time. Although, I just do not see them improving the game's economy in any way. That is here to stay, as even though it frustrates the majority of players, all they need is a few whales to spend tons of money to make it worth it for them. Even if it makes the game sell less, the amount of money those whales spend will make up for it. What I'll do is a year from now, I'll take another look at the game and see how it's improved over time, and make a video about it then. I am extremely curious to see how well Forza Motorsport 8 performs when that inevitably comes out, as if they do a good job with it, they can easily surpass where Gran Turismo is now. Thanks so much for watching, I'll see you all in the next video.